Good afternoon, and welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Morris Williams, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to what I know is going to be a fantastic conversation. But first, let me remind you to please turn off your cell phones or any other device that might go off and interrupt our speakers. And also, no flash photography, please. And also a welcome to all the people upstairs in the overflow audience. We're delighted that there's been such a great turnout to hear David Axelrod talk about his terrific new book called Believer. You have information about David in your program, but did you know that he grew up in New York City and went to the University of Chicago in part to separate himself from having lived in New York City all of his life, and he never left Chicago once he got there, because politics was and is his passion, and I'm sure that he will cover some of those insights about politics. Did you know that David Axelrod was involved in both of the campaigns for Mayor John Street? And so there are interesting stories, including a reference to a bug that appeared in Mayor Street's office, and how they handled that very successfully. As you recall, Mayor Street won re-election in a landslide. So that's another item that you might want to explore in the time of the Q&A. Mr. Axelrod will be interviewed by E.J. Dionne, who is a terrific reporter, political analysis for the Washington Post, and also a frequent guest on various shows on CNBC and other networks. One other just brief reminder about David Axelrod. He's been involved in over 150 political campaigns. So he knows a lot, and we shouldn't hesitate to look forward to his insights. So please join me in giving a wonderful Philadelphia welcome to David Axelrod and E.J. Dionne.
Thank you all for coming today. I just want to say it's great to be at the Philadelphia Public Library, a place that is wonderful both to readers and to writers. And my late mom was for many years a public librarian, and public libraries are one of the most important and underrated parts of government. So. I also have the dad of my assistant and my former intern, who is president of Penn Dems over at the University of Pennsylvania. And I told him this morning that the Democrats are clearly coming to Philadelphia because of Sean Foley's leadership at Penn Dems. It's a great privilege both to be here and to be with David. This is a really fun book. And if you have a passing interest in politics, and I just have a hunch that people here have a passing interest in politics, there's all kinds of stuff.
There are also people who have an interest in passing on politics. But that's,
well, David just told me that when they put the subtitle 40 Years in Politics on here, he was fearful that that would kill sales of the book, because 40 years?
Oh, my God.
But you learn all kinds of stuff in this book. You learn, for example, that one of the earliest campaigns David Axelrod worked on was for a Republican. Yes. Now, it happens that was John Lindsay, a very liberal Republican who later left the Republican Party.
And if you want to know what they look like, go to the Field Museum. They have them stuffed and on display.
You also learn that he once almost took out Barack Obama. That is to say, he almost broke his nose at a basketball game. And fortunately for...
Right here in Philadelphia.
Yes. And fortunately for both of them, he wasn't fired after that. You learn what he thinks about a lot of people. Somehow he doesn't seem to like Mark Penn. And there's some interesting episodes there. You learn that...
I like William Penn, if that's good.
Yeah, we didn't rehearse. He's good. You also learned that he almost became Bill Clinton's communications director and turned down the job for family reasons because his family needed him at that point. And there's all kinds of other stuff here. I am going to start out with a kind of pairing of questions. My questions will largely focus on the last several years with President Obama, which is only part of the book. I'm going to the first part is a softball, and the second part may be less of a softball. The softball is on the word believer in your title and the word believe. And this seems to have been an obsession of yours for a long time. I always thought change we can believe in explained why the campaign had an almost religious connotation, because I always thought the word believe may have been more important than the word change. But this goes back to a slogan that you had for Paul Simon's presidential campaign, which was "It's time to believe again."
Isn't it time to believe again? Yes.
Could you talk about your sort of focus on this word "believe" in politics?
Yeah. Well, at its core, I believe in politics. I believe in politics as a way to gently steer the course of history in the right direction. In this book, I talk about my first political experience when I was 5 years old, and John F. Kennedy came to Stuyvesant Town in New York, where I grew up. And the woman who took care of me when I was a little boy, when my mother was at work, was an African-American woman named Jessie Berry. Wonderful, wonderful woman. Classic story, came up from the South, had no formal education, very little. Took care of other people's kids too, so she could take care of her own. And she heard that JFK was coming to Stuyvesant Town, and EJ, you'll appreciate this was on October 27th, 1960. The thought of a Democrat campaigning in New York City 10 days before a presidential election is like a quaint memory, because it wouldn't happen anymore. They only drop by Manhattan to raise money these days. But she took me out and she put me on this mailbox, and 20th Street, which is a big boulevard filled in with people. JFK jumped up on this platform, and everybody was transfixed and looking at him, and his voice was booming off the buildings. And I thought this seemed really important and meaningful. And years later, obviously I was 5, so I didn't exactly absorb. A reporter asked me, did you take notes? And I said, yes, I took notes in crayon and stuffed them in my... But years later, on Google, which is something no one could imagine then, I found the speech. And what JFK said was, I'm not running on the presidential platform that says if you elect me, things will be good. He said being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with challenge and hope, and we'll decide which direction we take on November, I think it was 8th. But the point is that there is meaning in all of this. His brother said, the future's not a gift, it's an achievement, which is the epigram in my book. I believe that we have the ability to impact on the future in a positive or negative way, and the way we do that is through the choices we make in politics. So I deeply believe in this, even though there are many reasons to be very cynical about politics, and people are very cynical about politics. But at the end of the day, it's very, very meaningful, and people are hungry to believe in it. I think. I mean, they'd like to believe that we can do positive things through this process, and I think we do. And so I wrote this book in part to make the case that this stuff matters, that it's meaningful, and I particularly am interested in talking to young people about this, because we need young people who care deeply about the world to understand that politics is a valid way to make a difference.
Now, Sarah Palin famously spoke of
See, he told me he had a softball question and a hardball question, so I decided to talk overlong on the softball question in hopes that he'd forget the hardball question.
Sarah Palin is actually not your problem on this question, as you'll see. Sarah
She's
Palin,
actually not my problem at all anymore. So.
In fact, there was rather great elation, as you'll learn in the book, after initial fear about Sarah Palin. There was great elation in the Obama campaign. But she talked about the hopey changey thing, and During the primaries, you were running as the candidate who would change Washington, and Hillary Clinton ran as the realist who understood what was going on. And I want to recall for you one of Hillary Clinton's great moments in the debates, which you probably remember well. She said, "I could just stand up here and say, let's just get everybody together. Let's get unified. The sky will open. Celestial choirs will be singing, and everyone will know that we should do the right thing, and the world would be perfect." And then she went on, "Maybe I've lived a little too long, but I have no illusions about how hard this will be. You're not going to wave a magic wand." And it struck me that in the book, your conclusion at the end of it all may be a little closer to where she was. You write in the book, it's a bitter irony that the election of a president on a mandate for that change touched off such a furious counterreaction that it would end up only exacerbating the problem. Obama couldn't bridge the divide. I'd like you to reflect on where you were back in 2008 and where Hillary was and where you are now.
No, that's a very fair question. In fact, I noted in the book that in our debate in New Hampshire, after we won the Iowa caucuses, Hillary said, I don't want to give the American people false hope. And which was really the same point. And we really went to town on her for that, because the notion that hope was false and that we shouldn't shoot high and so on was antithetical to the whole theme of our campaign. And the reason I included it was because, in retrospect, I understood more clearly what she was saying, even though if I were advising her, I would have told her not to say it. But one of the traps of our campaign that we knew was a trap was that the president, then Senator Obama, inspired such a reaction. And I said in the book that by the end of it, we'd see these huge crowds, and he turned to me one day and said, we're going to have a really hard time living up to people's expectations. We knew the skies weren't going to open. Nobody was expecting celestial choirs. We understood that. But was it harder than we thought it would be? Yes, it was harder than we thought it would be. And it was harder in part because the irony is we swept in these huge Democratic majorities on this vision of bipartisanship and cooperation, and the Republican Party made a strategic judgment that, okay, fine, you guys have these big majorities, we're in the thick of this big economic crisis, we're going to let you handle this, because it's a much better political decision for us to let you make the hard decisions, and we're going to run against you on them. And it turned out to be a shrewd decision, and the byproduct of it was they forced the president to become a much more partisan figure than I think he wanted to be. And so, are my feelings tempered a little bit by that experience? They are. And here's what I would say that's kind of interesting moving forward. People say to me, well, you ran a campaign against Hillary Clinton and she lost 2008, why is it going to be any better now? I think times are different now. We have had this experience. I don't think people are going to be looking in 2016 for a presidential candidate who can, change the system. I think it's more likely that they're going to be looking for a presidential candidate who they think can manage the system, navigate the system, perhaps better than they think Obama has navigated the system. In Washington, I say in the book, presidential races are always defined by the outgoing incumbent, and people, no matter how popular the incumbent is, never look for the replica of what they have. They always look for the remedy to what they see are the shortcomings in that person. So in a sense, what was a weakness for Hillary in 2008 may be a strength for her in 2016.
I think the subtitle under David right now is Axelrod endorses Hillary. Is that what it
I'm
sounded
just saying,
like?
man.
You're likable enough, David. I just want to ask you, there was that moment in the debate, many of you remember, in New Hampshire, which seemed to break the dam for her although in the book you had a very bad feeling going into New Hampshire after Iowa. What happened that night? What was?
Well, it was, look, from the moment we landed in New Hampshire, we had put everything into Iowa, and the feeling was if we won the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary was, I think, 5 days later, and that there would be no time for anyone to recover, that we could win the New Hampshire primary and essentially wrap up the nomination. That was our A theory. We had a B theory for a long trench warfare that we prepared for better than they did, and that was why we ended up winning, 50-state strategy. But we arrived in New Hampshire, as I wrote, like a conquering army. And we went to these events, and we were way up there on this lofty plain, and, we were just there to collect our winnings. She, on the other hand, realized she was in mortal danger. And it had the effect, Hillary was a very, I think, poor candidate in 2007 because she was so weighted down by this presumption of inevitability that she was unwilling to venture anything. She was unwilling to be revealing of herself. She wasn't connecting with people. That all changed in New Hampshire, and suddenly the roles were reversed. She was close to the ground. She was really working to connect with people. She was much more revealing of herself. And now we were up on this pedestal. We were the inevitable candidate, and we campaigned that way. And I just, having spent a year being the insurgent, I was uncomfortable up on that pedestal. And I really, it just felt wrong. You've been in politics long enough. You have a gut for these things. Everything felt wrong to me, even though the polls were saying that we were in really strong shape there.
Yeah, I want to go back a little, but before, I don't want to leave the sort of looking back on the presidency. I have always wanted to ask you this, so I might as well ask it to you here. I have
to answer it.
What?
Yeah, where I have to answer it.
I was always surprised that you stuck with the Obama administration, you, David, it's clear in the book, with still the hope that you could bring around the Congress after the stimulus fight. And that when you look at the health care battle, which you talk about quite a lot in the book, it struck me that keeping the bill in the Senate committee, the endless quest for Republican support. I remember talking to a healthcare advocate at the time saying, we're organizing an intervention to free Max Baucus from his dysfunctional relationship with Chuck Grassley. It was a real mess, and yet you guys sort of kept the bill. You allowed that process to move forward. Why was it so difficult to pivot off? Okay, those hopes are nice, but that's not going to work out with this crop of Republicans.
I think because we knew, as difficult as health reform was, and as big a change as it represented, that it was desirable, if we could do it, to forge some sort of bipartisan legislation. The practical issue was that we needed to get 60 votes in the Senate, and it wasn't guaranteed that all the Democrats were going to be supportive. Senator Nelson, for example, from Nebraska, was balky right to the end. So there was a practical reason that we needed some Republicans, but there also was, history suggests that it would have been, optimal if we had bipartisan support for the bill. You're right. The Republicans sent an early signal that and McConnell later acknowledged that they had made a decision that they weren't going to work with us on any major thing, that they were going to make us go it alone. And in retrospect, if this is what you need me to say, EJ, I will say it. It was a mistake. It was a mistake. We really we held the bill open for months. We allowed the opposition to organize in that ghastly summer of 2009 when the Tea Party really exploded. And it was painful. But even that fall, there was still hope, for example, that Olympia Snowe would come. And I talked about how the president said, hey, we can call it the Snow bill. He said, she can live in the White House. He said, Michelle and I will get an apartment. He was, we really wanted to try and forge that. And we also thought we might need the votes. And the truth is, right until the last minute, it wasn't clear that we would have the 60 votes, and there were famously, blandishments were offered to Senator Nelson that ended up being a problem for us, and in order to get his support. So there was a mix of practical reasons and sort of historical reasons that we wanted to get Republican.
I always thought the Lincoln movie was a defense of the Cornhusker kickback.
It was.
Basically, you needed to make deals.
Yeah, the problem was they hadn't made the movie yet.
Go back to the beginning of your first encounter with Obama. There were plenty of people. I met him as a state senator in '97, and there were only two people I'd ever met whom I thought right at the start. I came home to my wife and said, these guys can be president. One was Bill Clinton, and the other was Barack Obama. And you saw it in him. You saw that potential.
Now, will your wife affirm that actually happened?
My wife would cover for me, but yes, I've actually heard her tell that story.
Good. All right, I believe you.
So we know a lot about journalists never mind. Bless him. No, I tell you, if you look at my column today, gaffes. It's fun to read the book, by the way, to learn about gaffes, including President Obama's. And one of his favorite words, I was going to ask you about this, is sloppy. The word sloppy appears here over and over again because that seems to be his primary critique, both of himself and of others. I have a column today about Brian Williams where I talk about what he did for a neighborhood where my family lived, my wife's family, after Hurricane Sandy. And I cut him some slack because he had a really big heart for those people. So I don't want to, a lot of people are coming down on him that he doesn't need me. But to go back to meeting Obama, how did that get set up?
I tell the story in this book. A friend of mine named Betty Lou Saltzman, who is like a doyen of liberal politics in Chicago, called me in 1992 and said, I just met the most remarkable young man, and I think you should meet him. And I said, I'm happy to meet anybody you want, Betty Lou, but why? She said, I don't know, I think he could be the first African-American president of the United States. And I always...
Was this before or after the congressional race?
No. This was before. He just got back from law school. Yeah. He was he didn't hold a public office. He barely, I think he maybe had just passed the bar. And so I always joke that when I go to the track now, I take Betty Lou with me because she's got such a...
How does that work?
Instinct for the winners. So anyway, so I really haven't taken her to the track. So I was trying to think of a witty retort to cover for the fact that was just a joke.
Axelrod admits gambling problem. That's how the media would deal with that.
Exactly. That would be the takeaway from this whole discussion. So anyway, I went to see him. We had lunch, and as I wrote, I didn't leave, humming "Hail to the Chief," but I was really impressed by him. I was impressed by him because here was this young guy who had just gotten back from Harvard Law School. He had been president of the Harvard Law Review, could have written his ticket at any law firm or corporation in America and been set for life. And he came back instead to run a voter registration drive in Chicago and to work at a small civil rights law. And clearly he had political ambitions, but his ambitions... I think I always say the world of politics divides into two categories. There are people who want to do something, or one's more numerous than the other. The numerous one is people want to be something, and then there are people who want to do something. And he struck me as one of those people who really wanted to do something, who wanted to make a difference, saw politics as a calling. And so I was really impressed by him, and we didn't work together. He ran for the state senate in 1996. I followed his career. He in his early years in the legislature, he was the Democratic point man on welfare reform. They wrote a more progressive version of welfare reform than many other states did. He passed a reform bill, first campaign finance reform bill in Illinois in 25 years. And this is what passes for campaign finance reform in Illinois. That law proscribed office holders from raising money and then keeping it. Seriously. In Illinois, the law allowed you to keep all the money you raised and use it for yourself as long as you paid taxes on it. And so he shamed them into into. They thought they kind of thought of it as tipping, but he
a lot of summer home dreams went up in smoke.
But he eliminated. So he did very well in the legislature. He was clearly a standout there. He then, as you pointed out, had run for Congress in 2000, which was a disastrous decision in a bad race, and he lost by 30 points. And we really came together.
Bobby Rush is the only American who's beaten Barack Obama. Is that right? Other than Hillary in some of the primaries.
Right. Bobby says that all the time.
I bet he does.
In 2002, we both were going through kind of an existential crisis because he had lost that race. He was personally in debt because he wasn't making money when he was running for Congress, and he had promised Michelle that he would take one more shot at politics, and if it didn't work out, that he'd get out of politics. I was at a crossroads because I was really sort of I was becoming depressed about the sort of cynical nature of my own business of political consulting and how campaigns were being run. And the thing that brought this to a head was that I had a client in Illinois in the 90s whose name you may or may not know, named Rod Blagojevich. And I always get the same reaction. I worked for him when he ran for Congress. I liked him. He was a pugnacious guy. He seemed to have a real sense for working class people. He was very nice when he got elected to Congress, nice to my son who was going through some difficulties, and he was an intern in Rod's office. I liked Rod. But he came to me in 2001, said he wanted to run for governor. I was kind of appalled by that because that's a good governor's like a real job. This is not Congress. This is, and I said, why do you want to run for governor? And he said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, if I need to help you figure it out, you shouldn't run. That's not what I do. I left. He hired another very good firm. They did state-of-the-art work for him. They conceived a very well-conceived campaign, and he ran. The governor before him went to prison as well. You remember George Ryan. So, not painting a great picture of the land of Lincoln here. And so he ran as a reformer. Rod ran as a reformer. And I knew him well enough to know that maybe this wasn't exactly who he was. And it was, it ran on a no new tax platform when the state clearly needed new revenues and so on. But he was winning, and he was going to win. It was clear in the summer of 2002 he was going to win. He was running against a very nice guy, a conservative I didn't agree with, but a really decent guy. But it was like watching Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. I mean, Rod was just running circles around him. And Barack called that summer and said, I'm thinking of running for the U.S. Senate. I want to talk to you about it. And I went, other people had recruited me. There was a Republican senator who ended up not running. This was for 2004. And there were other candidates better funded, better known, who had asked me to work for them. But I went home and I talked to my wife, Susan, and I said, if I could help Barack get elected to the U.S. Senate, that would be something I could be proud of for the rest of my life. And I really saw it as a way to recharge my idealism.
Although you were against it at first.
I was worried for him, since he had one shot left, that I didn't want him to overshoot. And I suggested some alternatives. One was waiting for Mayor Daley to retire, because I thought he would be a great candidate for mayor of Chicago. He, like a lot of people, thought that could be decades. It had already been decades, and he really, so anyway, he said, no, this is what he wanted to do, and I could see a path, and it was a path that required a lot of things to happen for us. One being that Carol Moseley Braun, who had been the senator in that seat and defeated in '98, didn't come back and try and run again. She ultimately didn't. She ultimately ran for president instead. But so it was a long shot, and we went around with our tin cups trying to persuade people that he could win. But there was a wonderful innocence to it. It was charged with the idealism that we ended up infusing the 2000. It was the campaign in which the Yes We Can slogan actually came about. You know, in the first...
Which you've used at least 3 times now, right? 04 for Deval Patrick, and then in the
06 for...
presidential.
yeah, well, we modified it for Patrick to Together We Can, and we brought it back. But it was important, though. It wasn't just a tagline. It's a concept, which is, it wasn't just about him. It was about us. It was about all of us doing this together. And it was this notion that we could shoot high, that we could actually accomplish big things. It was affirmative and it was hopeful. And I really liked it. And I put it at the tagline of a commercial. And his first ad, and he got to the end of it, and it was, and he delivered the line, and he stopped and he said after the first take, "Yes, we can." Is that too corny? And I'm like, eesh, I really love that line. And I explained to him why I thought it was good. And Michelle Obama was sitting on a staircase because this was his first ad. She wanted to see him shoot it. And he turned to her and said, "Mish, what do you think?" And she said, she just shook her head, said, "Not corny." And he said, okay. So he didn't really trust me, but he trusted
But you
her.
understood the most important alliance in politics is the candidate's
Indeed,
spouse.
indeed. Yeah. And we went forward from there. But it was a magical race. You know, we had hoped there was 7 people in the race. We had hoped to get 38% of the vote. On election night, we got 53% of the vote. And
Of course, your 2 strongest opponents were each knocked out in a scandal. He is a lucky man.
Yeah, although I had this discussion with someone the other day, because it is true that both in the primary and the general that there were opponents who were formidable, who improbably both were involved in sort of sex scandals. Yeah, and but I absolutely believe that we would have won the nomination either way. I mean, he was a phenomenon, and he took the state by storm in much the way that he took the country by storm. So it really was a re-energizing thing for me, and I'm not sure I would have stayed in politics but for that. And when you know, in 2012, when on the night that Obama won, I saw him. And I knew this was my last campaign. It was his last campaign. And I said, "Thanks for letting me get my idealism back."
Can I, there's a whole lot of things I want to ask you, but I would like to ask a sort of double-barrel question. One is, you talk a lot about how Obama is progressive, but he's also very pragmatic. And
yes.
There are a whole bunch of decisions he makes, like why he didn't name Elizabeth Warren to head the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Early on, to get his state Senate seat, he was willing to knock somebody off the ballot by going after their petitions. That is about the most basic, you know, tough political thing you can do.
Well, and she was an ally of his. I mean, she was a woman who had the seat, ran for Congress, lost a primary for Congress, and decided after recruiting Barack to run for the seat that she was going to run. And so he had to sort of make a decision as to whether he was going to honor her reversal and he challenged her petitions, which weren't really in good shape, and knocked her off the ballot. Yeah.
You can talk a little bit about his pragmatism. I'm told that I want to go to the audience, and there are a couple of sort of there are so many interesting moments in this book that I'd like to go to, but I'll have to do that some other time. Maybe I'll do your next stop. So
yes, I've got a bunch of them. So.
You have some interesting, friendly criticism, if you will, of the president in this book. I'm just going to quote a couple of lines at you and have you talk about how this affected his presidency. You said, "Calm has too often been read as detachment, deliberativeness as uncertainty." You also say that hint of moral superiority and disdain for politicians who put in elections first has hurt Obama as a negotiator. Now, note, he's very loyal in this book. He casts even the flaws as virtues, but that's a very interesting sort of take on him. And you say you can't take the politics entirely out of the process. I'd love you to talk a bit about the sort of political education of Barack Obama over this period as you watched it. And, you know, if he has learned things from this. I've always thought if you gave Bill Clinton a Barack Obama discipline injection, and Barack Obama a Bill Clinton schmooze injection, you would have the perfect politician. But we are all who we are.
Yes.
But I'd love you to talk about all that.
Yeah. There are laboratories where such experiments are now underway.
Well, your firm is doing that now, I understand.
But look, my strong view, and not just about politicians but about people, is often our strengths are also our weaknesses. And Obama's great strength is that he does believe that, you know, when we won, when we passed health care, he said to me the next day, I was happier last night than I was the day we won the election. And he really meant it. And he said, because winning elections, he said, that's just the semifinals. That just gets you, you know, only part of the way. But winning, passing a law like this, he said, that's what it's all about. That's why you run, and that's what he believes. But also related to health care, when he was talking to the Democratic caucus about it, he made a great speech to them. We're riding back to the White House. This was before it passed. And he was looking out the window. He said, what are they all so scared of? And I said, well, I think they're scared of losing their jobs. And he said, well, what's the point of being up here for 30 years if you never do anything? And I said, you know what, I get it, and I know you believe that. But, you know, for most of these folks, they'd love to do good things. But if it means making a choice between doing good things and being up here for 30 years, they'll take the 30 years. And he has a hard time sometimes relating to politicians on that level, whose first instinct is survival. I call them the Schumerites, right? I mean, no, I don't. I mean, look, I have a lot of respect for Chuck Schumer. I think he's a great politician, smart guy. But his basic view, and he articulated it as, well, we shouldn't have done health care. It was a bad political decision. It was a bad political decision. Well, when the president... when we took on it, I mean, I made the political argument why we shouldn't do health care.
You were against it.
I was against it, and it was hard for me to be against because I have a child with a chronic illness. I was one of those Americans who almost went bankrupt when she was small because she had epilepsy. We couldn't afford all the medications. I mean, $10,000 a month out of pocket on a $38,000 salary. It was rough. I knew we needed to do it, but I really worried. You know, 7 presidents had tried, 7 presidents had failed. I knew what the polling was like. I could see it was going to be a very costly venture. And he said, "Well, what are we going to do? Just put our approval rating on the shelf for 8 years and admire it, or are we going to draw down on it and try and get something done?" And he felt if we didn't do it in the first 2 years, we wouldn't get it done. Schumer's view is different, which is you don't jeopardize your next election. But that's kind of the reason why we never deal with some of these big questions that linger and get worse. So, you know, I admire Obama because he's not that kind of politician. By the same token, it also makes it harder for him sometimes to relate to politicians. 80% of Washington being in the Schumerite category. Relate to politicians for whom elections are the most important thing.
I feel like having a whole debate about Chuck, but we'll leave that aside. I think we're going to go to questions, so I'm going to ask one final question. You have a very interesting history of working for a lot of breakthrough African-American candidates. You work for John Street here, you work for Michael White in Cleveland, you work for Deval Patrick in Massachusetts. And you were very pointed about race in this book. You basically, right at the end of the book, you sort of say that we in the Obama administration really didn't want to talk about this because it was politically dysfunctional, but you note that no other president has seen his citizenship persistently and angrily challenged. Never before has a president been interrupted in the middle of a national address by a congressman screaming, "You lie,"
right,
and so on. Talk about the role of race, and both in terms of the breakthrough, but also in terms of the political problems. And then it's all yours to the audience.
Well, look, it is indisputable. One of the candidates that I worked for, a really charismatic fellow named Harold Washington in Chicago. When Harold got elected mayor, he got elected in part because there were 2 strong white candidates, and his base in the African-American community made him the nominee. And as the Democrat, he squeaked by, but got just 8% of the vote in his first election, a white vote. And you probably remember, E.J., you may have been there, I don't know, but in 1983, when he was campaigning with Walter Mondale on the northwest side of Chicago, there was a scene at a church, St. Paschal's Church, that was so ugly that it was almost something like out of the Deep South. In the civil rights era, people shouting racial epithets and so on. And the night that Barack Obama got elected to the U.S. Senate, I checked and saw that he had carried that precinct. And I said to him, Harold's smiling down on us tonight. We've made enormous progress. I think of that woman, Jessie Berry, who put me on the mailbox. She would have been floored to think that the little boy, well, she would have been floored to think that I had gainful employment. But she would have been floored to think that I worked 20 feet from the first African-American president, and I was instrumental in helping him get elected. So let us certify that we have made huge progress on race in this country, but we obviously have a long way to go. And there is no doubt we are becoming by the day a more diverse country. I think that's a strength. But it's also, especially when you have the overlay of the economic situation we have, it is a flare point for some people who are resistant to that change. And Barack Obama is symbolic of that change and the fact that he is the president of the United States. And so there's no doubt, I don't think that all the resistance to Obama has been about race. I mean, Bill Clinton had plenty of resistance too, as he would point out.
He got impeached.
Right. Yeah, although, you know, you hear the Republicans now, I sit with Joe Scarborough sometimes on Morning Joe, and Joe says, you know, we got along great with Bill Clinton. We got all these things. I always say, but Joe, you impeached him. You know, you had to, so it isn't all about
details.
It isn't all about race, and racial antagonism doesn't just attach to black candidates. Democrats generally have dealt with that since the civil rights era, when all those civil rights laws were passed. But there's no doubt that there's an element of vehemence among some people and some politicians who are pandering to racial sentiments on the part of some of their constituents that are rooted in the fact that he is black. And to deny that, I think, is just nonsensical.
Thank you. And so we got... Thank you. We have the mic going around.
We have mics on both sides, right?
On both sides over here.
Yeah.
If you could identify yourself and ask your question.
Hi, David. David Hyman. Nice to see you.
Hey, good to see you. Yeah, long time.
Yeah.
This is not a planted question.
No, it's not. You're talking about relationships with Congress. What concerns me at least as much is the sense I have that the president hasn't developed close relationships with any international leaders. Am I correct, or are there examples that counter that?
Well, let me just say I'm answering as someone who hasn't been in the White House for 4 years. In the time I was there, I saw him work constructively with Merkel and others. Does he have close relationships with those leaders? I can't speak to, or to many leaders, I can't speak to that. And I did write in the book that I think sometimes the same impulse that makes it harder for him to relate to politicians also applies to relationships with foreign leaders. And David, I talked about Bibi Netanyahu as one of those people. And the tension was that the president firmly believes that the future of Israel as a Jewish democratic state requires a resolution to the occupation of land and to the status of the Palestinians. Occupation is probably not the word I should use, but the status of the Palestinians, and that a two-state solution is necessary for and in the interest of Israel. And Bibi has said he believes the same thing, that he believes that there should be a two-state solution. But when it came time to do things that would promote that process, the president felt that Netanyahu was focused more on his governing coalition than on solving that problem. He had frustrations with the Palestinians as well, by the way, and Abbas. There were times when he did things that roiled the process. So that's been an ongoing tension. It's probably not being helped right now. With Netanyahu accepting the invitation to speak to Congress in what appears to be an effort to undermine the Iranian negotiations, which are coming to a critical point in March. I think the president has worked constructively internationally in the sense that I saw him put together the Iranian sanctions. People ridiculed him. EJ will remember this at the time for thinking that that could be effective or that he could put together withering sanctions. Now the same people who were ridiculing him are saying, we need more sanctions. Let's have more sanctions. So, you know, that is not someone who's ineffective in dealing with world leaders. I saw him, leader by leader, the Chinese, the Russians, and others, make the case for why those sanctions were important. I saw him play a key role in dealing with world leaders around solutions to the global economic crisis. I think he's been effective. He's been effective in international forums. I can't speak to the level of his personal relationships.
By the way, in the book, there's a very unlikely scene. David does Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And receiving a bag of jewels, an alligator bag of jewels that he was not allowed to keep.
Yes, we all went to our, we were staying at King Abdullah's ranch, and we all went to our bungalows, and on the bed were gift-wrapped attaché cases, and you open it up, and there was probably $200,000 of jewels in there. So
we still don't know if he snuck any out of the bag.
I wish I had. Valentine's Day's coming up.
Hi, good afternoon, David. As a Democrat, I didn't see a lot Mr. Obama get to achieve because I think race make a big thing in it because he tried so hard but still didn't get it. I'm looking forward to see Hillary Clinton run and win the first woman president in America. What do you think? Do you think that Hillary will get more done, not because of a woman president, but not of race? You think she will do a lot better, put race out of it?
Well, let me just say one thing about, I will answer your question. I do not want anyone leaving here thinking that I believe somehow that this president didn't have major accomplishments because, and that, you know, the political situation or race stopped him from accomplishing things. I saw him save this country from an epic economic crisis. I saw him, we had 180,000 troops overseas when he took over, and I saw him bring almost all of those troops home. I mentioned health care, and I just want to say one thing about the health care bill. Once the president decided to do it, I was all in. And every time people were urging us to throw in the towel, he was the one who kept us moving. And that's the only reason it passed. The night it passed, I described this in the book, I was in the Roosevelt room adjacent to the Oval Office and my office, which was next to his, with everybody who worked on it, the president, the vice president, everybody who worked on it. We were watching the final votes come in. And as the final votes came in, I found myself getting up, and I walked into my office, and I closed the door, and I had a really big cry. I mean, not little sniffles, but big sobs. And I didn't even know why at first, and I thought I realized it. I remembered how horrendous and how frightening it was when my child was sick. And when I was worried not just about her health and her survival, but also whether we were going to go bankrupt and how we were going to afford all these bills. And I knew that other people wouldn't have to go through that because of what he did. And I went and I found the president. And I said, I just want to thank you on behalf of my family and all those who won't have to go through what we went through. And he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, that's why we do the work. And, you know, that to me, in a sense, sums up my whole feeling about why politics matters. So, you know, if you're a gay or a lesbian American want to serve in the military, your life is different today. If you're an auto worker on the line instead of sitting on a couch unemployed, your life has been impacted by what this president did. There are so many different ways in which he's moved the needle forward. You know, he's moved history. So let us not leave saying that somehow it was a missed moment. I think history is going to be very good to this man. But in terms of, I do think, as I said to EJ, I do think that people always look for a different style. I think Hillary's style, as someone who has worked within the system, who is seen as a pragmatic sort of operative within the system, someone who can manage the system and navigate the system, I think will be helpful if she gets elected president. So, you know, and my hope is, I know we're going to move forward. I hope that we can build on what has been done. We've stopped we've put the economy in motion in the right direction. We're not cascading toward disaster, but we're growing better. We're in better shape than most of the world now. And now we have to focus on that fundamental problem, which is, are we going to have a country where people who work hard can get ahead, where there's economic mobility and you're not destined to finish where you started no matter how hard you try, and where there's not these big gulfs of opportunity and of wealth. And I think that you know, we have a chance to do something about that, and I hope that she is the leader who does.
Someone on this side of the room?
I apologize because I know I'm chewing up everybody's question time.
It's very smart. You get fewer questions that way. He's done this.
40 years of politics, man.
My name is Patty Goldentire, and I have been an avid supporter of the Democratic and the party and the process. I don't really understand how people have such a desperate point of view that the Republicans seem to be holding, where they go pretend we don't have any social problems at all, and hold on to this idea, well, if you just keep the money and the power with the richest people, everything will be fine. Could you try to explain that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Defend the Republican Party,
yes.
David. Going back to your Lindsay years.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I could defend them a little more readily back then. Look, first of all, let me just strike one small dissenting note, and I may have referenced this earlier, but I've been struck by the fact that in the last few weeks we've seen Mitt Romney stand up and talk about poverty. We've seen Jeb Bush talk about inequality and the problems facing. No, I'm not saying this to be facetious. Marco Rubio writing a whole book about the middle class. I don't agree necessarily with their answers to these questions in every case, but I think it's actually progress that we're all now talking about these problems. And so we should take some solace in that. And what I'm looking forward to is if we can, you know, one of the things that's been really disturbing is the fact that, not that we didn't agree on solutions, but we couldn't even agree on the problems. I think the fact that we're now all acknowledging that inequality and the plight of a middle class spinning its wheels and falling behind, and poverty and the inability to escape poverty are all big problems, that's progress for the country. And I hope we have a big debate about it. You know, about what do we do about it? That would be the best result of a 2016 election. I strongly, obviously, disagree with this notion that if somehow people at the top do very well, that all of this will trickle down and we'll all benefit from it. And, you know, I think we are, in fact, in a new Gilded Age, just like we saw at the end of the 19th century, where the industrial age dawned and created these great disparities and oligarchs and so on. I think we've seen a repetition of that to some degree. And, you know, I just disagree with that philosophy. The other thing that I think is really, really dangerous is the answer to it, without question has to be in part, are we investing in research and development, education and training, infrastructure, the basic building blocks of an economy that will throw off the greatest opportunity in the future. And if you take the position that we will never add one more dollar of revenue, and the less we do, the better, we are dooming, not just dooming people, everyday people, but I think we're dooming the United States in the long term and our economic progress. So I think that's a very serious debate that we have to have. So no, I'm not going to explain to you why they think that. They'll have to write their own book and come here.
Somebody on this side over there?
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Diane Bass.
Hi.
And hi. You did a wonderfully articulate and moving description of all of President Obama's accomplishments. And I think he did it as well in his State of the Union address. However, during these last disastrous midterm elections, every candidate could not run away from him more quickly.
How'd that work out for him?
And that's my point.
Yeah.
But
I got where you were going.
yes, but whose failure of communication was it?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to pass the buck, and I wasn't involved anyway, but I have to say there was a judgment made on the part of people on the Hill, Democrats on the Hill, and part of it had to do with that 6 of the senators who were running for re-election were running in states that Obama had lost by 19 points on the average in 2012. Their feeling was the less he's out there in the face of this campaign, the better, and that somehow if you run away from him, to the point where you had a candidate in Kentucky who had been an Obama delegate to the 2012 convention unwilling to say in the debate that she had voted for him, which didn't enhance her stature in the eyes of voters in Kentucky. I think that it is an absolute fallacy to think that you can run away from a president of your own party. And it's been tested in history time and again. It never works. And it didn't work this time. And the shame of it is, I mean, I was one who advocated in my informal discussions with people around there, including the president, that he be out there. A year and a half before the election, I was arguing, let's go out there and engage this economic debate in a big way. And I wish he had made the speech he made at the State of the Union a year earlier. And we should have built our whole campaign around that. I think it was a big mistake. So, I take your point and I agree with it.
I just want to follow up on that because in your book you have the following sentence. Yet Obama was inclined to divide his roles, viewing campaigning as one thing and governing as something entirely different. And it always struck me that he was great as long as he was one-on-one with an opponent, but he had enormous trouble messaging the larger program all the way through, including here. It struck me that part of that was he is a very competitive person whose roots are in sports. And he really gets one-on-one competition, but he had some real trouble moving.
Well, I think there's something to that, but I think it's a little more
I
little more than that.
Suggest that.
You covered Mario Cuomo, and you know his famous quote about you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Which is a really great concept, but totally wrong. And I don't even think Cuomo believed it, actually. Right. Because part of being in office is you have to be effective in office, you have to continue to have message discipline and describe where you're going in a way that people can. The president's belief was elections are about elections. And once you're governing, you've got a whole range of things you have to deal with, and you got to deal with them all. You can't sort of limit. In a campaign, you can pick and choose what you want to talk about, but when you're governing, you have to deal with all of them. He furthermore believed that, whereas you're answering questions in a campaign, you answer them in a strategic way, thematically, and so on. He believed that he had an obligation as president to give people full and complete answers on every question, hence, and you probably have been there, the 7 or 9 minute press conference answer. So in many ways, he throttled himself as a communicator because of this belief, and I think it hurt him. But in this case, he was throttled by others. I think he wanted to get out there and make this economic case strongly, and he was asked by the folks in the Senate not to do that. And I think we may not have won any of those seats, but I think at the margins it would have made a difference.
Over on this side, I think we got time for a couple more. Is that the? Thank you.
Hi,
Hello.
Linda Burke. Thank you for believing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a nice thing. I like that.
Yeah, it is. I'm going to get verklempt. She thinks I'm kidding.
Now I'm going to forget my question if you keep going. Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig
Yes.
claims that our election process has been corrupted by money to the point that if we don't deal with it, we're not going to be able to deal with any of the issues that are facing us, like infrastructure, immigration. I wondered what your comments were on that, and if you agree with him, what can we do?
You know, what's interesting is I think there's something to what he's saying, corroded if not corrupted. But the two issues that you name may be two issues that we actually can deal with because the plutocrats actually believe that those are things we ought to deal with. I mean, they believe that we need to do something about infrastructure, and they believe that we need to do something about immigration reform, not so much because of people at the low end of the immigration debate, but they're really interested in reforming this H-1B visa issue so that people with high skills can stay rather than being trained here and returning to compete against American firms. So, you know, the irony is that those are issues that may actually be helped by the power of the plutocrats. But generally, do I think that, you know, it is good or helpful to have, you know, oligarchs who, as they do in many European countries, who basically supplant political parties as the source of funding for candidates? I obviously don't. And let me just say one thing on this campaign finance reform piece, because I know EJ will ask this if I don't admit it before he gets to it. I wrote in the book that, you know, the Obama campaign in some way was complicit, at least in accelerating this proliferation of money in politics, because we made a decision in 2008. It was one of those pragmatic decisions that we were afraid of being overwhelmed by money on the other side, and particularly by third parties like the 2004 Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, and that we didn't want to be bound by the campaign finance system. And we ended up raising $800 million, exponentially more than had ever been raised in presidential campaigns before. A fair percentage of it came from small donations online, but not all of it by any means. There were big donors in there as well. It helped us win the presidency, but it was one more step in the dissolution of campaign finance reform. I'm not a huge fan of campaign finance reform only for this reason. I don't think it's worked very well. We've created basically a cottage industry for lawyers who figure out how to circumvent the system. So instead of making the system cleaner, we've made it sneakier. And, you know, so I've mused about whether what we should have are just really, really rigorous disclosure laws, because one of the bad things is now a lot of the money isn't being disclosed with all these loopholes. Rigorous disclosure laws where people actually go to jail if they don't disclose, or a candidate forfeits office or whatever. So at least we know where the money's coming from. But it's a problem, and there's no doubt about it.
I just have to dissent on that last point, then I'll stop quickly. I think the system was working somewhat before Citizens United, and that we have made
there's no doubt about that.
We made the system work. I've got one more question.
No
By the way,
doubt about that.
the headline on that is Axelrod praises plutocrats, admits we wrecked the campaign finance system. This lady in the back, the hand up there.
This is how EJ survives in the modern media environment.
Yeah, right. I always wanted to work for a tabloid, you know.
Hi, congratulations on the book and great
Thank you.
career. And
Thank you so
I'm not
much.
going to ask you about the book. I'm going to ask you about the tour. You were present at what's turned out to be a major seminal moment in our culture on Tuesday night. on the Daily Show.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
I have to tell you, I was telling EJ, it was an unbelievable experience. One of my colleagues, Tim Skozik, is sitting here, who did wonderful work on this book with me, and he was there, and some of my other colleagues, and my wife, Susan, and we were in the green room and waiting to do the show, and Jon Stewart came in, and it was clear something was on his mind. He said, listen, there's something I think I need to tell you. He said, I'm going to make an announcement tonight that's going to make some news. And he said, you know, I'm leaving the show. And I mean, we were like floored. It was like we walked into history here. And, you know, I believe that he's been an extraordinary force in our politics lately. So I was just trying to get my arms around what it meant for him to be leaving that show. And I went out and I did my bit with him. In between, you know, it's clear how emotional it was for him. It was a big decision. He explained, by the way, in the green room what he said publicly, which is, you know, there are a lot of things he wants to do. He just made a movie. And there are other things. He's an incredibly bright and creative guy. And he wanted to spend more time with his family, which I write in my book about the demands of my career and some of the regrets I have about the sacrifices I inflicted on my family, particularly because we had a child who was struggling and other children who were struggling with her struggles, and my wife was left to fend with that. So I admire his decision to do what he did. But it was, so in between segments, you know, he leaned over and said, I'm just trying to get through the night here. So it was kind of an honor to be there. I also was the beneficiary of it because he built a pretty large audience for my book interview. So.
He set it up. I just want to close by reading a couple of lines from David's book, and he is signing them after this event,
Yes.
I take it.
Yes, I'm signing them.
Congress is going to meet with you or without you. Don't turn away in disgust and leave those decisions to someone else. You don't like politics today? Grab the wheel of history and steer us to a better place. Thanks for never giving up.